Hello, BookTube. David Wiley and I, joined by Tony at An Erudite Adventure, and also any of the rest of you who want to join in, are doing a somewhat odd read-along that we've started sort of impromptu. And I'm very glad that we started it this way. We're reading J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, but we're skipping the first part. We're skipping the Fellowship of the Ring, which is where all such read-alongs begin, and moving instead straight away to The Two Towers, which is the second part of the book. An interesting way to do it. Nothing is really lost here. Tony and David and I have all read The Lord of the Rings many, many times. We're not losing anything here. We're not advocating that if you have never read this book, you read it this way for the first time. But if you have read it before, this is turning up all sorts of inspirations for me. Just in the ways that I read the book and the resonances that I find in it, I'm loving it. Absolutely loving it. I don't know what the future plans are. Tony and David are both very busy people, so I don't know if they want to move on with the rest of Lord of the Rings or anything else. I have no idea. I'm just kind of thinking that whether they join me or not, I'm kind of thinking that I will continue chapter by chapter with the rest of the Lord of the Rings. In fact, I'm halfway tempted when I'm done to wrap around and do chapter by chapter of the Fellowship. I wonder how I would feel reading the Fellowship last here. But for now, we are reading The Two Towers. And I mentioned last time that The Two Towers represents two books. It's a split of two books. The goal here, the quest, the general quest, is to get the one ring, the ruling ring, the creation of Sauron, the Dark Lord of Middle-earth, to get it to Mordor, his stronghold, and destroy it in the fires of Mount Doom, where it was created. The goal here is that. The ring is thoroughly evil. The good guys decide in the Fellowship of the Ring that the only worthwhile, the only responsible thing they can do is destroy the ring. Not hide it, certainly not use it for good. Get rid of it. So they set out to do that, and we've seen in the first part of The Two Towers what happens to that quest. It falls apart. And ends up with Frodo the Hobbit and his servant Sam carrying the ring into Mordor alone, on bare feet. Now, in the last chapter, we see that they are joined by Gollum, character from Tolkien's The Hobbit, who has borne the ring for a long, long time. He had the possession of his precious for centuries before Bilbo Baggins came along and stole it from him. So he seems involved. Gandalf points that out, that somehow he seems involved in this story, and maybe, who knows, what his full involvement will be. Now, again, those of you who have read Lord of the Rings will know what that full involvement is, and that's kind of interesting. It's interesting that he comes along with Frodo and Sam. They have only the most general idea. Fortunately, Sauron sort of hangs a big sign outside his window that says, "Hey, I'm evil." So it's easy to spot Barad-dûr, his one of the two towers. It's easy to spot Barad-dûr from a great distance, so it's navigating is not hard. It's not hard for Frodo and Sam to figure out in what general direction they have to go. But it's a long way, and they don't know the intervening ground, and Gollum does. He's been there. He went there. He encountered orcs. He encountered other things that we get our first hint of in this chapter. This chapter is called The Dead Marshes, and it's Gollum leading Frodo and Sam. He has sworn to help them, and he is leading them along the path that he remembers taking to Mordor. Now, we know already from the Fellowship of the Ring that Gollum's association with Mordor was not a happy one. He was captured and tortured there for information, and then released to create more mischief. So there's a very valid question here. It was valid the first time I read this book, long before most of you were born. It's still valid when I'm rereading it now with kind of fresh eyes, which is why on earth would Sam and Frodo trust Gollum at all? Why wouldn't they think that he's leading them into a trap, that he's been suborned by Sauron or somebody? Reading this chapter, The Dead Marshes, becomes quickly really obvious to me in a way that it wasn't before, that they don't really have a choice. He at least knows the terrain, and what are they supposed to do? Tell him you can't come with us? What if he does anyway? They're not going to kill him, and they're not going to maim him. So Gollum is along for the trip, and this is the chapter where we get the famous split mind debate that he has with himself about what to do. I've sworn on the precious to serve these two hobbits, but shouldn't I betray them? But I don't want to betray them. They're starting to awaken in me Smeagol. They're starting to awaken in me the person that I was before this horrible thing happened to me. But that doesn't matter because you don't want precious falling into his hands. This is a split brain dialogue between two halves of Gollum that is dramatized in Peter Jackson's Hobbit movie very memorably by Andy Serkis. But before that scene happens, our heroes walk and walk. They walk and walk. They are going further and further towards Mordor, and they were on the broken ground and steep cliffs of Emyn Muil, and now they're in the Dead Marshes. They're in just this endless landscape of sucking mire and glossy pools of muck and reeds. They have elvish waybread. They have lembas. Frodo and Sam do to sustain them, and they draw whatever. They have water in their canteens. They draw whatever clean water they can find. Gollum won't touch it. He has one tiny nibble of a piece of lembas bread, and it revolts him. Frodo actually says to him at that moment that I think this food would do you good. And we can imagine, again, hypothetically, we can imagine what would happen if Gollum had eaten quite a bit of lembas, if he feasted on it with them. Would it have helped him? There's a vaguely supernatural element involved in lembas. Would it have started to cure him from inside out? We'll never know because he doesn't do it. Instead, when he's hungry, he goes off into the mire and finds things to eat. We're told, Frodo and Sam, that they don't know and they don't want to know what he's gone off and eat. It's pretty clear that Gollum has become exclusively a carnivore, and also a carnivore of live meat. So, no lembas for him. But he does agree to help, and he knows, roughly speaking, a way through that mire from one semi-solid lump of ground to the next, without much in the way of mistakes or catastrophe. The closest that we get to a catastrophe is the famous scene from this chapter, where Sam realizes to his horror that there are faces under the water, that there are dead things under the water that are signaled on top by little, what were called candles. They're called candles over and over again, little floating will-o'-the-wisp lights. And because we don't have Aragorn along, or Elrond, or Gandalf, all we know is what Gollum says. The battle was fought here a long time ago. Men and fierce elves and orcs and a bunch of other things, and a whole bunch of people died. And the narration tells us that slowly the marshes just claimed it all. They claimed whatever barrows or tombs were made. But that's it. We don't get, we lack here the instant exposition that Gandalf would provide. Instead, we don't know. It's just genuinely creepy. It's a genuinely creepy thing. And our heroes have their struggles with what to do about Gollum. They make a vow early on. Well, we'll have to take turns sleeping because we can't both be asleep with this creature here. He might eat us, or steal the ring, or steal our food, or who knows what. And in typical Hobbit fashion, they no sooner make that vow than both Sam and Frodo end up just going sound asleep several times. So Gollum is left unsupervised quite a bit, but he seems to be holding true to his word. It's only when Sam hears that split-brain dialogue between the two parts of his tortured soul that he, and therefore we, start to get a sense of how conflicted Gollum is on the inside about the ring and about helping these hobbits. And that's where we get his enigmatic mention, not only of the he with a capital H that he refers to is obviously Sauron, but he starts to make mention of she as well, with a capital S. This is where we get our first mention of that. First readers through this book will be wondering what's going on there. Sam wonders, well, is he referring to one of these maybe some horrid friend that he made in this horrible wasteland? In a way. Yes, readers of the book know who she is and what's coming. But I appreciated it a lot more. I have often derided these Hobbit-only chapters as being very boring. I don't think it's possible not to feel at least a little bit of that when you're coming from the high epic fantasy of the first book of The Two Towers. I don't think it's possible not to feel at least a small sense of a letdown when you get to chapters in which characters are just walking again, with no high deeds, no valor, no kings, no nothing like that. We do get a hint of terror, the same way that we did in the Palantir, the last chapter of the first book in the Two Towers, because 3 times our heroes throw themselves to the ground because a gigantic winged form that brings fear and terror before it and after, that seems to flatten the whole land. 3 times such a thing passes overhead. Sam mentions that, well, 3 times isn't innocent. 3 times, once or twice, sure. 3 times is a pattern. And Gollum outright says that that the riders of those winged beasts, the Nazgul, can feel the ring. They can feel the One Ring. They know that it's closer than it should be. And not much is made about that. Don't the Nazgul talk with Sauron? I would assume that they report to him regularly. They are his servants, after all. Doesn't whoever that was who's flying over the Dead Marshes 3 times in this chapter, doesn't he go back to Sauron and say something's not right? Or even if Gollum is right, doesn't he maybe go back to Sauron and say the ring is near? Keep in mind, Sauron thinks the ring is in Rohan. He thinks that the mighty that Gandalf has it. Or if he doesn't know that Gandalf exists, we're sort of on the fence about that point. Does he know that Gandalf exists or doesn't he? But he certainly knows that there are powerful captains and elves in the West. He assumes that one of them has the ring. The last thing he thinks is that it's headed for his kingdom on foot. If the Nazgul do sense it getting closer, if that's what accounts for their repeated reconnaissances of the Dead Marshes, then don't they tell Sauron that? Nothing serves to alert him, as far as we can tell, in this chapter. And we just keep traveling. There are storms, there's that being flying overhead, but we just keep walking. Until night passes and the scenery shifts. I want to read you a bit to show you how much I am appreciating this read-through of the Two Towers. Because this is wonderful. It's highly melodramatic. It very much harks back to the pulps, which I'm pretty sure Tolkien fans and maybe even Tolkien himself would steadfastly deny he ever read. You be the judge. If you know Conan, for instance, if you know Robert E. Howard's Conan stories, listen to this passage and tell me that Tolkien never read a pulp. It goes like this. At last, on the 5th morning since they took the road with Gollum, they halted once more. Before them, dark in the dawn, the great mountains reached up to roofs of smoke and cloud. Out from their feet were flung huge buttresses and broken hills that were now at the nearest scarce a dozen miles away. So they've made a lot of progress. They're right on the doorstep of Mordor. Frodo looked round in horror. Dreadful as the Dead Marshes had been, and the arid moors of the no-man's land, more loathsome far was the country that the crawling day now slowly unveiled to his shrinking eyes. Even the mere of the dead faces had some haggard phantom of green spring, but here neither spring nor summer would ever come again. Here lived nothing, not even the leprous growths that feed on rottenness. The gasping pools were choked with ash and crawling muds, sickly white and gray, as if the mountains had vomited the filth of their entrails upon the lands about. High mounds of crushed and powdered rock, great cones of earth, fire-blasted and poison-stained, stood like obscene graveyard in endless rows, slowly revealed in the reluctant light. They had come to the desolation that lay before Mordor, the lasting monument to the dark labor of its slaves that should endure when all the purposes were made void, a land defiled, diseased beyond all healing, unless the great sea should enter in and wash it with oblivion. I feel sick, said Sam. Reads a little pulpy to me, but that's actually how the chapter ends, with our characters on the doorstep of Mordor. And I loved it. I'm really enjoying this. I have reading it slowly in company with other people, so, literally a chapter a day. And reading it without the Fellowship of the Ring has really helped me to see a lot of what's going on in these chapters that I was sort of impatiently waiting to get through before. In previous times when I've reread The Two Towers, I have skipped these chapters and just read the first book. But much as I love this chapter, and much as eager as I am to go on to the next one, this does raise a question for me. that I want to ask you. Questions that keep coming to my mind. I had a question about the last two chapters of the first book of the Two Towers that I'll get to later on. I want to wait a while and marinate on that question. But the question I have here is very connected with the one that I'm not asking, and that is, what is this errand? What is this quest? I mean, I suppose with elvish cloaks that help you to hide, and with a little bit of luck, and maybe a guide like Gollum, Frodo and Sam could get to the Black Gates of Mordor. They could get to Barad-dûr. But then what? Then what? What is this quest? There's no chance whatsoever. I mean, when you get down to the details of it, there's no chance whatsoever that Sam and Frodo are going to be able to get into Mordor unobserved. Okay, but they did. Okay, then there's no chance they're going to be able to get to the doorstep of Barad-dûr unobserved. Okay, but they do. All right, fine. But there is no chance at all that they or anybody else could enter Barad-dûr unobserved. And don't they need to do that? Don't they need to get past the Black Gates of Mordor to get to Mount Doom? The final stage of this errand seems utterly impossible, and I'm not criticizing here the hobbits. I'm not criticizing Sam and Frodo, because this would have been every bit as impossible if the whole fellowship had made it this far. Or, as we mentioned in the beginning of our discussion of the last book of the Two Towers, if 1,000 elves with armor had gotten this far, it still wouldn't have made a difference. It would have drawn Sauron's attention to the whole thing. All right, so fine, you're sending a small group on foot so as not to draw too much of his attention, so as not to draw a military response. Okay. And then Sam and Frodo may take off on their own without the rest of the fellowship. Okay, fine, so they'll be even less conspicuous, and therefore have an even greater chance of getting further without being spotted. But what about the final stage of this? There's no way that the final stage of this mission, this quest, could happen. So what difference does it make, the rest of it? We now come to, what do Sam and Frodo, what are they supposed to do when they get to Sauron's stronghold? Why would they think that they would ever be able to get any further than that? I know the rest of the book, but nevertheless, on paper, as a plan on paper, it mystifies me. It really does. I mean, it's a desperate plan, obviously. It's a last gasp, so you'd want it to seem a little bit unlikely, but this doesn't seem a little bit unlikely. This seems like when it comes down to it and you're done with all the hills and all the marshes and all the wastelands, it's going to boil down to Sam walking up and knocking on the Black Gate of Sauron's stronghold and saying, "Here now, me gaffer wants you to let me pass." What other shape could it take? It really, I know that it's the talking of Saruman here, but it really does look like Gandalf, like these hobbits have wandered off, not only to their certain failure, but also to handing the ring to Sauron. In which case, you guarantee a swift and complete destruction of all freedom on Middle-earth, whereas if you hid the ring, or, for instance, as one of the elves in the Council of Elrond suggests, threw it into the ocean, you put off that day by a long, long time. You grant a lot more freedom and a lot happier days than if you walk the ring straight to Sauron, who cannot fail to notice. After a while, I mean, he's failing to notice so far, but he cannot, you'd think he cannot fail to notice this quest in its final stages. Even if that Nazgul, who seems to be concertedly checking the Dead Marshes, seems to know where heroes are. Certainly Gollum thinks he knows. Even if that Nazgul doesn't know, or knows and is keeping it to himself, not telling the boss, after a while, Sauron is going to notice. Two strangers, and he knows what hobbits are now. As soon as he sees them, he's going to know what they are. And it's not going to be hard to put two and two together and figure out what they're doing. They're not defecting. I just find it fascinating. That's all. I'd be extra curious to know those of you who are reading this for the first time. I've been honored to learn that a few of you are reading The Two Towers for the first time, skipping the Fellowship. That's fascinating. But even if you've only read it once, so you don't have it by heart, I'm curious to know what you make of this errand. What do you make of this errand that our heroes are on? I confess, at this stage of the book, it baffles me, and that's a testament. That too is a testament to Tolkien's narrative power, because it's supposed to baffle you. But this chapter still fulfills the pattern that we have. Whereas characters get together, they meet somebody, They talk, and then they say, off we go. Gollum's the one who says, off we go, this time around in this chapter, and the people that they meet are dead. The faces, these staring faces, these will-o'-the-wisps in the Dead Marshes. Very effective chapter. Beautifully done, too. I read you one description of the natural world, but the descriptions of the Dead Marshes are horrifying, but lovely. Lovely done. So I'm enjoying myself, eager to move on to the next chapter. So we will see. We'll see whether or not some of these confusions are resolved in the next chapter. So I'll wrap this up for now, and I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.